Hello again. Thanks for the introduction, Tim. My name's Nick McCreary, and what I'm going to talk today about is climate transition planning or climate action planning. I've been lucky enough to have experience working with climate transition planning in a wide variety of sectors, from higher education to municipalities to the corporate environment. And all of these areas are diverse in the way that climate action plans are put together and enacted, but they have a similar overall structure, and that's what I'm going to start with today. And hopefully from this presentation, you're able to take away a general framework for how climate transition or climate action planning works, and then also understand that for each organization or municipality, the intricacies of what your operation is doing will drive the real details of the climate transition planning. First, I want to make a note because especially when we work with municipal clients, there's a lot of confusion about what climate transition or climate action planning actually is. A lot of times the word sustainability comes up, or ESG, and that is conflated with the actual climate action planning. So let me give you an example of the difference between sustainability, which involves, or ESG, which involves economic, environmental, and social aspects of an organization or municipality, which can involve everything from tax implications to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I've worked with the university before where we created a sustainability plan that included everything from incorporating climate research into the business school to procuring locally sourced swag for basketball games, right? A big, wide range of environmentally and socially responsible planning. But one piece of that sustainability plan was to create a climate action plan. So a climate action plan or climate action is a piece within sustainability, and that distinction is important because climate action plans really are focusing on energy and specifically greenhouse gas reductions. Now, I'm not saying that water, waste, everything up here is not in some way included in a climate action plan, because there is a lot of overlap, and as we've seen in other talks, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions absolutely has positive health impacts, but the point of a climate action plan is not to improve health of the community. While it is a hopeful outcome, the point is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that's what all strategies need to be focused on as the main KPI is what are the greenhouse gas emission reductions from the different strategies. At the very highest level, and we're gonna break down into each of these, it's pretty simple at a high level, right? For climate action planning, there's three main steps. You need to measure, you need to plan, and then you need to communicate. Measuring starts with a lot of what our team has talked about here today. Measuring greenhouse gas emissions or doing a climate scenario analysis can really give your organization or city a baseline from where to build the climate action plan from. If you do not have a greenhouse gas inventory or a sufficient or accurate greenhouse gas inventory, then you're not going to, one, be able to know what emission sources to target for reduction. And additionally, you're not going to be able to track progress and report out that progress, whether it's to your community members, a reporting agency, your supply chain, or whomever else needs to see that information. I'm not going to go into the details of the different scopes. Hopefully we've covered that here today, but that's absolutely a first step. And same with climate scenario analysis. That's another 45-minute talk on what that process is, but essentially it's looking at how different risks and opportunities related to climate change could potentially impact your organization in a set time horizon, whether it's 10 years out, 25 years out. And those implications are important to understand when you're going into the planning process. So the first step, measure. And then there's a lot of little steps within that, but just understanding that measuring has to be first. You have to understand where you sit and where you're going. Next is the planning part, and I want to distinguish between three different words that I'm going to use throughout this presentation. You've heard targets a lot. This is probably the first time that we've mentioned strategies and actions. Targets are at the highest level and are a lot of times prescribed by a reporting organization. Like science-based targets is one that you keep hearing, and I will mention in this talk as well. Targets look at what are the goals per scope. So you will have a scope 1, 2, and 3 target, and that's about as granular as a target's going to get. So a lot of times you'll see reduce scope 1 and 2 emissions by 45% by 2030. That's a target, okay? The next level down is what we call a strategy, and I'm sure there's other words that can be used here, but we're calling it a strategy. So these are what are the processes that are going to take place to reach that target. So if we're looking at reducing scope 1 and 2 emissions, there could be two strategies for that, right? We're going to convert our fleet to hybrid vehicles or EVs. That's a strategy. Or we're going to improve energy efficiency in our facilities. That's a strategy. Both of those strategies would lead up to contributing to your scope 1 and 2 target. Finally, I'd say the most important part of all of these is the actions. Strategies are honestly kind of straightforward to come up with because they're being done all over the place. The actions is the important and difficult part. So the actions are what are the specific steps, who are the responsible parties who are going to carry out those strategies. It's really simple to say we're going to convert our fleet to hybrids. It's really difficult to do that. And that's what the actions are, very granular steps on who's responsible for this, where is the budget going to be coming from for this? What is the timeline to implement this strategy? And how are we going to internally report and externally report on those steps? And I'll get into more detail on how we look at doing action roadmaps in our specific examples. But that is the planning portion of a climate action plan. And finally is communication. And this is, I put this in a row as if it's the last step, but a lot of times what we're seeing is the requirement to report or to communicate your climate, whether it's your climate emissions or your plan, actually leads to the beginning of the process of creating a climate action plan. So given an example, we've worked with organizations that have been requested by suppliers to report their emissions and create a climate action plan to reduce those. Well, that is that's in the reporting sector, but in able to report that, you need to have a plan. So then you got to start back from the beginning. So we're seeing a lot of that. And I'm going to, in the slides where I talk a lot about the specifics of climate action planning for cities and for corporations, I'm not going to talk as much about communicating, but the two big areas here are your external and your internal communication schemes. And we've touched a lot on the different reporting schemas, whether it's CDP, EcoVadis, TCFD. Another big area that we see a lot of reporting occurring is in annual reports or annual sustainability reports. A lot of times TCFD disclosures are included through those, same with GRI and stuff like that. These different reporting frameworks can not only drive the creation of a climate action plan, but they can drive a lot of the different aspects within the climate action plan. So if you are being required to create a science-based target and report through CDP, then your baseline is essentially decided for you, and so are your targets, because those are requirements within those different frameworks. So the point to all of this is, yes, this is the last step, but it also kind of drives the former steps, because sometimes if you need to report a specific thing, you have to make sure that everything before that aligns with the ability to report that. The second step is not as public or sometimes public at all. The reassessment or the internal reporting that needs to occur to make sure a climate action plan is sustainable, is live, that it's developing over time, and it's actually producing the results that the targets and the strategies are intended. So it's not enough to put in your CDP report, we reduced our emissions by this much, and we have engaged 37% of our supply chain. That's great. But what about the people who are actually doing it inside your company? So having the cadence to report and check in with the people on the ground who are actually trying to achieve those KPIs, getting feedback, and then reincorporating what they have to say into updating a climate action plan yearly if needed. And that's what the adjustment portion is for. So that's a very high level. The next portion, I'm going to go into details about the differences between creating a climate action plan for a municipality versus creating a climate transition plan for a corporation. There are some large differences in the process between a municipal climate transition plan or a corporate climate transition plan. And it really starts with the greenhouse gas inventory. So talking about municipal climate action planning right now, the process to do a greenhouse gas inventory for a city is quite a bit different than a corporation. Amber and Fody had talked about this in detail early on, so I won't go into detail here, but there's two real main things that need to be considered when looking at municipal greenhouse gas inventories. One is, what is the scope of it? So a lot of times municipalities like to start with just municipal operations and the greenhouse gas inventories of just municipal operations. So we're talking like police department, public works, anything that's owned and operated by the city. Sometimes that includes waste, sometimes not. It varies per city. If that's the option, that looks a lot more like a corporate greenhouse gas inventory, because a city is kind of similar in terms of operating greenhouse gas-wise like a corporation. Now, a community-wide greenhouse gas inventory, that's significantly different. And this is the first big divergence between the two types of plans. So the main difference between a community greenhouse gas inventory and a corporate greenhouse gas inventory is, in a community greenhouse gas inventory, the amount of assumptions is significantly higher than with a corporate greenhouse gas inventory. And that's because the data is not readily available, if available at all. It's not easy to calculate or assume. And your constituents in a city are way different than your employees in an organization in terms of being able to access and request information. And even when looking at a supply chain, which gets complicated for a corporation, in a city, trying to understand, let me give one example. If we're looking at in a corporation trying to get the fuel data for scope 1, that's typically a pretty straightforward process. We look at fuel records, we look at employees turning in receipts for using company vehicles. That data is usually there, and if it's not, it's pretty easy to track down. Now, that same type of emission for a community is borderline a nightmare to collect, because you're looking at what emissions occur from the combustion of automobile vehicles within the scope of a city, right? So there is no true methodology to do this, and this is how a lot of these municipal greenhouse gas inventories take place. We try to start with the most reliable and straightforward method. So for this, if we could get sales records for fuel within the community, that's best case scenario and would provide the most realistic data. That's typically not available. And so then we would look, is there traffic studies? Is there anything the city has done to understand how much traffic flow is going through the city? If that doesn't occur, then we have to move to assumptions at the local or state or even sometimes national level of how much are people typically driving, how often are transboundary trips taking. And once you get down to this level, your data accuracy gets skewed a bit. And that's where I'm saying the amount of assumptions that are required are significantly higher for a city than a corporation. So that's your first big difference, is with greenhouse gas inventories. Next is with target setting. So we've talked a lot about target setting through science-based targets, and science-based targets is really the gold standard because it will align your targets with the Paris Climate Agreement, which is the best science available to make sure that we avoid severe climate change. But it doesn't always work for as cleanly, and it doesn't work cleanly for corporations, but it certainly doesn't work as cleanly for communities, because if you think about it, to be able to set a net zero target by 2050 for a community, which we're working on right now, would require that all electricity provided to their residents was either produced through renewable energy, or they have the ability to produce it themselves via solar energy or wind, which less likely for an individual resident. And that's not always feasible. So I'll give you an example from a community we're working with in Ohio. It's about 60% under the poverty line. So the purchasing of solar PV at the residential level is kind of out the door when you consider the income levels in this community. Additionally, I think it's like 80-something% of the residents there are renters. So that adds another layer of complications of you're not going to want to invest in a building that isn't yours, especially if you can't afford it. And so moving towards zero emissions at the residential level there is very tough. It's in Ohio, which at the state level is currently not very supportive of a transition to clean energy at the state level. So relying on greening of the grid in Ohio is not an option right now. And so setting a target for net zero emissions by 2050 for this community is not an option because there just simply is no path to get there currently. So what we advise, if that is not an option for a city, is to look at more short and medium term targets of what is controllable. So we know we can reduce emissions from city fleet vehicles. We know we can start moving emissions from waste away from landfills towards composting or increasing recycling rates. So these are targets that are realistic, and we can reevaluate yearly, every other year, to look at, has there been any sort of legislative change in the state that would allow for more green energy? What different changes have been made, but we would never advise to commit to carbon neutral when there's no clear path. So that's a big difference in terms of target setting for communities. And so once emissions are calculated, we have our targets set. The next big step is going into those strategies. And for communities, we do it in two different ways. And this is more similar to corporates. First, we do a literature review. So this is really looking at what are all the different plans that the community has in the past, that community partners, organizations within the community. Is there a large company in the community that has a climate action plan? We need to know about that. And we will put together a matrix that you see like this, where we'll have the different emission sources across the top with the different pieces of literature that we reviewed, and try to put together sort of a gap analysis of like, hey, there is already a lot of work being done in this one area, so we should pull from that and not try to recreate the wheel. This community is already doing a great job of creating a pedestrian plan and getting people out of cars. So why we should focus our energy there. But it's also important to see the gaps of, oh, this community has never done anything associated with waste, so this might be an area that we need to start having discussions. Another thing that we do with cities and also with corporations is benchmarking. So we'll look at peer communities. What are they doing? How have they found success? What have been their roadblocks? This is good both to gather information, but it's also good to help compel city officials to be a little bit more aggressive on climate action strategies, looking at like, well, the sister city over here has a composting facility, so maybe we should start to think about one here. So that's one of the benefits of benchmarking. And then I spoke about the gap analysis, looking at what has a municipality done, where are there some gaps in their processes, and what can we pull from what has already been done. Oh, this is looking at benchmarking. So this is a benchmarking report that we put together for one of our clients. Now, here is where municipalities greatly vary from corporations, is the community engagement aspect. So when working with corporations, we absolutely engage with stakeholders and those who work within the organization. But with the community, there are community members, people who live in the city. And it's incredibly important to engage with these stakeholders early in the process for multiple reasons. One, we are experts in climate strategies, but community members are experts in their city. And we need to understand what the culture of the city is, what they are looking for, so we can include them in the decision-making process. Additionally, we need to gain the trust of the community members, because ultimately they're going to be the ones who are going to, in some cases, carry out the recommendations that we provide. So we want to make sure that the community members are a part of that planning process, feel a part of that planning process, so that they are more encouraged and excited about carrying out some of the opportunities. Once we have a list of our strategies, we will then start moving into the action phase. And the first step here is doing a feasibility study in one way or another. It could be through surveys, interviews, focus groups, a combination of that. I'll give a quick example of what this looked like in a recent client that we had. We noticed in the greenhouse gas inventory that a large portion was coming from the police department. And so the obvious strategy, right, is, well, why don't you have electric police vehicles? There's no emissions from that. So we brought this strategy to the police department in a focus group, and we immediately learned, like, that's not feasible for several reasons. One, electric vehicles don't provide the same protection to police officers if they were in a situation where they would need to be shielded by their car, because there's no engine block. Okay, great. We wouldn't have known that if we didn't do a feasibility study. Additionally, we found out they have been testing electric vehicles, and they are looking, they're continually looking at trade shows of what's coming out. And so that's where we started to understand a strategy recommendation for this community is probably to encourage them to continue to explore the EVs, but for now, do the lowest emission vehicles that you can, which is hybrids. Actions. So once the focal groups or the feasibility studies are completed, this is where we will lay out sort of a playbook for the different stakeholders that will actually be implementing the strategies. So we will sit down in the feasibility portion and make sure that what we have written out step by step aligns with their capabilities, both labor-wise and financially. And if it doesn't, make sure to include those additional pieces in a plan. So if a wastewater treatment facility does not have the people power to implement a new process, we'll need to include as a recommendation, there needs to be another FTE if this is going to happen. Otherwise, it's not feasible. And that's what an action roadmap would look like. So corporate climate transition planning, like I have said this whole time, is quite a bit different. And one of the big reasons why it's different is there have been quite a few publications that have outlined different ways and expectations from corporate climate action plans. That does exist for cities, but not to the extent where cities need to report in such a particular way like TCFD. And we are seeing it move in that direction, especially with the recent EPA funding that is coming out. There's very specific reporting requirements, but that's only for massive cities. So for corporations, a lot of times the climate transition planning process is being initiated because of a TCFD request. And so therefore following the guidelines within TCFD is very important. And let me make one note about the difference between a climate transition plan and a climate adaptation plan. So both would be considered part of an organization's climate strategy, but a climate transition plan is really looking at how is an organization going to reduce their impact on the environment, reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. An adaptation plan would be doing the opposite. How is the organization responding to the climate risks and opportunities that will be imposed on the organization? So that's an adaptation plan. So that's not what this talks about. We can, I'm happy to stay after and chat more if adaptation plans are something that's important, but just want to distinguish that this is looking at greenhouse gas mitigation. 6-ish steps for a corporate climate transition plan. And I say steps, but really it's a totally iterative process. So step 3 may occur along with step 2. We may have to circle back to step 2 after doing step 4. So don't think of this as a completely linear thing. It's certainly something that needs to be reevaluated year over year and as the process is going. But first is determining a baseline, as a lot of us have mentioned, but also determining a motivation. That's big for corporations. Why is a climate transition plan being created? Then evaluating emission distributions if a greenhouse gas inventory has been done. If not, doing an inventory, then evaluating emission distributions and setting targets. Next would be understanding the impact on understanding the strategy, the reduction strategy's impact on business and future business. which can occur in step 4, which is projecting emissions and future scenarios. So looking at how does the business intend to grow and how do climate strategies align with that and reduce emissions even along a growth trajectory. 5th is evaluating the actions and how these actions will inform the strategy of an organization. And 6 is making sure that these strategies are being integrated at all levels of the organization, from the board down to the folks that are actually implementing the actions on the ground. Throughout this example, or throughout this portion, I'm going to use an example of a client we're working with right now. So it's in the back of my head. It's a global gift card manufacturer, and the first thing that we did when we started working with them is understand the motivation of why do you want to create a climate transition plan. There's a big difference between a company like Patagonia, who wants to create a climate transition plan because intrinsically they value sustainability as a core tenet, versus this gift card company who wants to create a climate transition plan because one of their largest suppliers asked them to do it. In this case, it was Microsoft. Some of you in here might have been asked by Microsoft to reduce your emissions by 55% by 2030. So there is a motivation. There's other motivations like investor requirements. So if you're an organization that's held by an investment firm very well may be considering not having a climate transition plan a large risk, and investment firms want to mitigate risk. That's how they make money. So that would be a motivation as well that we have seen. And this last bullet here is becoming more and more critical. In the example I gave about the credit card company, there keeps popping up more and more motivations as we continue through this process. Recently, we just had to disclose to the UK government because they are a supplier to the UK government, and the UK government has different requirements than Microsoft of different scope 3 requirements and different target requirements. So making sure you're staying on top of the emerging regulations, whether it's in the EU, California, or in the US, is vitally important because it can change what you have to do. Determining a baseline goes hand in hand with understanding a motivation. A lot of times you will not have the option of picking your own baseline, because let's go back to the Microsoft example. If Microsoft is asking you to reduce your emissions by 55% by 2030, which they are doing, they are requiring that you have a baseline of 2019. So you do not have a choice to have a baseline of 2020. You will have a baseline of 2019. So a lot of times it makes sense for organizations to have a consistent baseline across their entire transition plan, because it can get pretty complicated if we have a baseline of 2019 for our Microsoft share of services, but a baseline of 2018 for our Southeast Asian services, right? So having a consistent baseline is always ideal if possible. And a lot of times it's driven by your motivation for creating a climate transition plan. The next step, once a baseline is established, is to evaluate emission distributions and reduction strategies. So evaluating emission distributions can really be looked at in 2 ways. One is, how are emissions distributed across your organization, whether it's scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3, or more specifically through your fleet, through your facilities, etc. But also, it's becoming very important to evaluate your emission distribution geographically, because as we're seeing regulations pop up, as we're seeing supply chain requests pop up, a lot of times these requests are for specific geographies or specific service requests. So back to that Microsoft example, they are asking organizations to report their emissions for specifically for the operations that are being sold to Microsoft, right? So that is a way that the emission distribution needs to be chopped up for what services, what emissions are being essentially produced because of what we're selling to Microsoft. Same with the UK example. We need to report just UK-based emissions, and there needs to be a plan to reduce just those UK-based emissions. By doing that, you're able to identify different strategies. If you see that there's an oversized portion of your greenhouse gas emissions from in this gift card company's example, from their category 1, scope 3, so purchase goods and services, because gift cards are plastic and therefore that emissions is very high. We are targeting that area because we know there are viable alternatives to PVC, which is what most gift cards have traditionally been made of. There's bamboo and paper options and e-gift cards. So these are a lot of options that we're identifying by looking at the different distributions of their emissions. Again, back to setting targets. I won't spend too much time here. I know we've talked a lot about this. Science-based targets, best in class, not always possible. I do want to mention the difference between an intensity and absolute target. Vicki mentioned this earlier. An intensity target is really looking at your emissions per X, so per capita, per revenue, per product sold. That's a really good way to articulate emission reductions if you have a steep growth trajectory. Absolute would be what it sounds like, reducing absolute scope 1 and 2 emissions. Absolute's typically applied to 1 and 2. Intensity is typically applied to scope 3. So step 3 is looking at how would these strategies that have been articulated impact business strategy and financial planning. So let me go to the example of the replacing the gift cards with either a paper, bamboo, or online version. On the surface, this sounds like an easy transition, but when you start to look at how this impacts their business strategy, it's quite a bit more complicated. So a big portion of their business is selling gas cards. So if you get a card from like Texaco that you can swipe for gas, that is not an option to do an e-gift card because you have to swipe it at the tank. It's not an option to do a paper gift card because they're too thick and they won't fit through it. So understanding how completely transitioning plastic cards to one of these other substrates has to be viewed through the overall business strategy, because it's not just as straightforward of like, okay, tomorrow everything's going to be online. What about folks who don't have access to internet? What if there is a climate risk towards the substrate of bamboo? There's a lot of options that need to be evaluated from the business perspective and looked at long-term in terms of financial planning. And this gets sort of woven into projecting emissions and looking at future scenarios. So once you are able to sort of hone in on your different strategies and how they're going to impact your business, you really want to align, you want to look at how that's going to reduce your emissions over time in comparison with your projected growth, and also looking at future climate risks and what those impacts will have on your organization, which is done through a CSA, which this talk's on about. Happy to speak afterwards on that. So then evaluating actions and strategies is a very similar process to municipalities. We need to understand what are the cost implications, what's the ROI, when can this be implemented? For the gift card example, switching over is not as straightforward as doing it next week because there's a large backfill of stock, so we don't want to have that just sit there. We don't get that out the door. And how feasible is it? It goes back to my example of being able to swipe it at a gas tank. Finally, and not finally, this should occur throughout the whole time, is engaging in discussions with leadership all the way down to those who are implementing the process. And TCFD does a great job of outlining this, and CDP requires it as well. How are these different strategies being articulated to the board level? How is the board overseeing these strategies? How is the management level managing the KPIs? And then what sort of resources do those who are implementing the strategies need? And then how is this being reviewed on an annual basis so that those recommendations can be reapplied through additional updates to a climate action plan? Here's a quick example from a steel producer that we put a climate action plan together for. This is looking at the projected greenhouse gas emissions. So the light blue line here is the projection of total emissions if under a business as usual scenario. And then the darker blue line is a projection of emissions under the scenario in which the reduction activities were taken and incorporated. This needs to be updated yearly because this line could have a lot bigger drop. It could not be reduced as much, and that needs to be reevaluated yearly in both cases. Here's another a view of this plan that just summarizes the different recommendations and implementation strategies for this organization. Quickly note that there's a big difference between the public-facing plan versus internal documents. Internal documents are much more precise with the action steps. Public-facing plans are meant to be readable and just give an overall view of where the organization's going. And then here's another look at how low carbon initiatives in terms of electricity would be reduced over time. And I think this was due to PPAs or power purchase agreements and RECs, and how that would impact the scope 2 emissions for this organization.
All right, thank you.